This episode is brought to you by DistroKid. DistroKid is the easiest way for musicians to get their music into all the platforms: Amazon, Apple, Tidal, TikTok, YouTube, Spotify, and more. Plus, you've got unlimited uploads, and the artist keeps 100% of what they make. But what I love most about DistroKid is their app. The design of it just makes the whole process so easy. Now you can be sure that you're doing everything you need to do to get your music out there. Go to distrokid.com to check it out or download the app now.
Allow me to live and breathe like a man.
You've heard his words on classic albums like Pacific Ocean Blue and Friends. His 1969 collaboration with Brian Wilson, A World of Peace Must Come, gained almost legendary status as one of pop's most storied lost albums, before being resurrected to great acclaim by Light in the Attic in 2008. Now you're cordially invited to take a trip into the mind of poet and songwriter Stephen J. Kalinich. Heyday Again Records presents I Love My Life, a postcard from one of the last standing poets of peace and excitation. Order your copy today. I Love My Life by Stephen J. Kalinich and Friends. You'll see why heavy hitters like Brian Wilson, Dennis Wilson, Paul McCartney, Steve Cropper, P.F. Sloan, and Diana Ross have all worked with him. I Love My Life by Stephen J. Kalinich. Order today at realgonemusic.com. Again, that's realgonemusic.com.
First one to
I have two favorite songs of all time. They're tied for first because I can't really choose which of the two I prefer. And the tone of both of these songs must mean that I have some kind of severe depression issue, because it's Van Morrison's Listen to the Lion and the Beach Boys' I Just Wasn't Made for These Times.
Wow. Yeah, that's pretty heavy, man.
Welcome to another episode of Discograffiti's wildly in-depth Beach Boys series and Your Dreams Come True, where Brian Wilson freaks like you and me get our chance to delve deep into the barely believable history and prodigious discography of my favorite band of all time, and also coincidentally the best, along with a slew of over 50 top-shelf guests ranging from musicians inspired by their work, family members, documentary directors, songwriting collaborators, Beach Boys authors, producers, touring band members, and for good measure, some of the Beach Boys themselves. I'm your host, Dave Gebroe, and special thanks goes out to co-producers Chuck Granata, Dennis Dykin, and Mark Freed, without whom this series would not have happened. And in this episode, we'll be turning our spray cans on the Beach Boys' Pet Sounds, along with our special guest, author and pet sounds expert Chuck Granata. This is episode 6, an examination of everything you'll ever need to know about I Just Wasn't Made for These Times and the title track. Here are just a few of the many things that Chuck discusses with Discograffiti in this podcast. The use of the Electro-Theremin in I Just Wasn't Made for These Times, which stands as its first usage in a pop rock record ever. Tony Asher's inability to personally connect with the lyrics to I Just Wasn't Made for These Times. The spiritual successor to the song that Brian created and recorded with Andy Paley in the 1990s. The true origin and first draft title of the title track. And how both Chuck and I connect with I Just Wasn't Made for These Times and Pet Sounds in a laid-bare, explicitly personal way. If you're a Beach Boys superfan like me, you'll want to turn this free version off right now and opt for the director's cut of this episode on our Patreon page, which features 19 additional minutes of essential material, which amounts to the entirety of the section on the title track. And you can find it in our Patreon shop for mere pennies at patreon.com/discograffiti/shop. Here's what you're missing this week if you're not a Patreon member. If you're a member at the private tier, you're missing out on our exclusive interview with the Electro-Theremin's creator and most famous player, Dr. Paul Tanner, the man who put the vibrations in good vibrations, plus the director's cut of an exclusive interview with Pet Sounds lyricist Tony Asher. If you're a member at the lieutenant tier, you're missing out on the Tony Asher interview, and if you're a member at the major tier, well, you're not missing a thing. But even if you're on the fence, just head over there, because it's finally free to become a basic member. And you don't want to miss being notified about every single one of these episodes. Because coming up, we got an interview with Lenny Waronker, Al Jardine, Bruce Johnston, Tony Asher, Jimmy Webb, Kim Fowley, Phil Ramone, Paul Tanner, Larry Knechtel, Don Randy, Dominic Priori, Bob Irwin, Mark Lynette, Billy Strange, Hal Blaine, Larry Levine, Carol Kay, plus an incredibly special Graham Nash deep dive, in which Graham himself rates and discusses everything he's ever released. That means solo, CSN, CSNY, CNN, and for good measure, Crosby's If I Could Only Remember My Name. So don't miss out. Open up your listening app right now and subscribe. And away we go then. All right, we're back with the Pet Sounds Deep Dive. Chuck and I have just gotten retreated for a severe case of the bends, and my lung capacity is at minimal. How's yours doing, Chuck?
Well, I'm coming out of the hyperbaric chamber and I feel just a little better. I feel like my head is cleared and I'm kind of making my way back to sanity.
If I've met anyone who's deserving of sanity, it's you, my friend.
Oh, thank you. That's very kind of you to say.
Especially for this upcoming track. We are on I Just Wasn't Made for These Times. And I'm going to say right at the head of this thing that I have two favorite songs of all time. They're tied for first because I can't really choose which of the two I prefer. And the tone of both of these songs must mean that I have some kind of severe depression issue, because it's Van Morrison's Listen to the Lion and the Beach Boys' I Just Wasn't Made for These Times.
Wow. Yeah, that's pretty heavy, man. I don't know if I could ever say definitively what my favorite songs of all time are, because I have so many musical interests. You know, do I include Beethoven's Seventh Symphony on that list? It's one of my favorite pieces, or Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue, you know, and then there's so many standards, and then songs like this, which is so reflective of what Pet Sounds is about. This is what Pet Sounds is about, this song that we're about to discuss. But where does it fit in? I mean, I've often said that God Only Knows and Caroline No are my two favorite songs on Pet Sounds, but then I can't not include I Just Wasn't Made for These Times. You know, it's very difficult to quantify and reduce your preferences and your likes to a simple list. It's just, you can't do it.
I just am not moved by anything as profoundly as I'm moved by those two songs. And this one is really the summary zenith of Brian Wilson's career to me. I mean, this to me is his epitaph. It feels like it was created with that in mind. It feels like it's almost like the lyrics are a tombstone inscription in a sense, you know, like a summation of one's life. Also melodically, if you just take away the vocals, the track itself is so fraught with emotion, every aspect of it, and the counterpoint of the vocals on top of it take it in a completely different direction. But, you know, the guitar, do dit 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 do dit dit boop 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 boop. Just that alone, I mean, if you follow the threads of any of the melodic components that weave their way through this song, they're a gathering of separate journeys that somehow, and all of them equally emotionally cathartic, all of which somehow gather together to produce an almost unbearably emotional result for me.
Well, and that emotionality comes right from the downbeat, that first note, which I think is so beautiful and so achingly expressive, really tells you what you're about to hear, that you're going to hear something that's complex and deeply emotional and revealing. because that's really what this is. This is Brian basically taking all the layers of veneer off and revealing what his life and this record are about at that moment, that he is searching to find himself. And where does he fit in? You know, how does society see him? Not as a celebrity, not as a famous recording artist or songwriter, but as a human being. And when you view this song in the context of a relationship, which is really what the framework of the concept for this album is, it really takes on unbearable pain and meaning.
I honestly don't know. I don't know where it fits in the context of a relationship. I honestly can't tell you how it threads into that. Can you?
Well, I always felt my takeaway when I listened to this song, especially in relation to the other songs on the record, which obviously, you know, they all point back to the feelings in a relationship. I think Brian is admitting that maybe he doesn't fit in, and he's trying to figure out not just where he fits in life and how people view him, but also how he's viewed by his lover or his, you know, significant other. You know, I think that sometimes we are not sure where we fit in our relationship. And I think this idea, this concept of saying, I keep looking, you know, I'm searching, I'm doing some self-introspection, all of that is applicable whether you're thinking about your career or where you're headed in life or your relationships.
And also the way that this is sequenced, just the fact that the searching precedes the devastating loss of innocence of Caroline No is also
right.
It's tough.
I agree.
So I Just Wasn't Made for These Times was written by Brian and Tony, and the lyrics describe the disillusionment of someone who is struggling to find their place in the world and in society at large. Musically, the melodic bass guitar, the layers of vocals, the wave-like counterpoints of all of Brian's vocals in the chorus, the Electro-Theremin solo, which is a whole thing in itself. And that actually marks the first time that that instrument was used in popular music. You know, and I'm talking about the Electro-Theremin, but also theremin-like sounds had never been used on a rock record at all. To me, that's the cherry on the cake, because that gesture in the arrangement is so perfectly musically reflective of the lyrical theme of the entire piece. So this was one of the last tracks that was completed for Pet Sounds. Brian produced the recording with the aid of 14 studio musicians, including the Electro-Theremin inventor Paul Tanner, who you so thankfully interviewed. What I'll probably do is line it up to this episode so that people can get a sense of who Paul Tanner was. The group of studio musicians that Brian assembled for this variously played percussion, basses, guitars, clarinets, piccolo, harpsichord, tack piano, and bass harmonica. All 6 Beach Boys sang on the track, and in addition to multiple counterpoints, the chorus features Spanish-sung backing vocals, which I didn't even know until doing research on this. And think of that. It's my favorite song. I didn't even know there were Spanish lyrics in here. O cuando seré, un día seré. When will I be? One day I will be. I Just Wasn't Made for These Times still remains one of the Beach Boys' most celebrated songs, and obviously very closely identified with Brian's personal life, so much so that 30 years ago, back in 1995, it provided the title of Don Was' documentary of Wilson's life, which is a great film. And in my interview with Don Was, we talk about it in depth, which is going to be coming up.
It's fair to say that this song, this few minutes of music and lyrics, is ground zero, not just for Brian, but for Pet Sounds, and for stimulating and embedding and planting this notion of self-introspection for anyone that was an adolescent at that time. But you really can't understate the importance of that Electro-Theremin and the mood it evokes, the tone it reflects, and how important that is to communicating the essence of the music and the song. It really is the defining moment. And, you know, it's interesting because in one way, it's whimsical. And in another way, it's really kind of plaintive, and you get this sense of yearning and longing from that sound.
This is Dr. Paul Tanner's introduction into the fold. This was only the introduction of the Electro-Theremin. Not that it would be used over and over again, but he came back several times to play for Brian and play on Beach Boys records.
Well, most notably, and our listeners will definitely appreciate this, it's such a big part of the overall sound on Good Vibrations. I mean, that's really what that has become noted for. And as your listeners will hear when they listen to my conversation with Paul Tanner, he is one of the most fascinating figures, I believe, in all of modern 20th century music. This is someone who was a trombone player who played in the original Glenn Miller band, and even younger people will know the song In the Mood. It's played at every wedding. He was on that recording session.
Not only was he on the session, but he was the last surviving member who played on that session.
Yes, that's right. So as you listen to this, keep that whole idea of this being a very innovative moment in mind.
There's this overwhelming sense that the lyric represents Brian's life, how he sees himself, his music, and as Tony remembers it, and, as he actually told you, Chuck, and I'm quoting from your interview, I think that I Just Wasn't Made for These Times was Brian's way of acknowledging that he didn't conform to the norm, that he was marching to the beat of a different drummer. We were certainly aware of what we were writing about when we approached this song. It was definitely a lyric written from Brian's perspective, although during the hours we spent writing, we didn't talk about his socialization per se. He never asked me to interpret his feelings in one of our songs, and certainly not this one. Brian never said to me, "Man, I remember feeling left out as a kid," or "I don't feel comfortable in a crowd," although you sometimes got the impression that that is what he might have been feeling. And by the way, to take a break from this, just to think of the image that Tony paints of Brian coming to Lauren Darrow's parties and sitting by himself for a while, awkwardly, sitting on a couch, and then leaving with a silent goodbye. I certainly get that vibe from that image. Back to Tony now. Quote, "We confined our conversations to the theoretical. What if we write about a kid somewhere who doesn't fit in? Many times when we were having idle conversations, Brian would express a feeling or emotion he felt for the song. I would often agree, saying, 'Oh yeah, I've had those feelings. I understand.' But in this case, I couldn't relate to the feeling of not fitting in. I remember that when we finished this song, I had the sense that it might not end up on the album. It takes a lot of courage for an artist to expose himself in such a personal way. Lots of times you question why you're doing something or whether it's any good. I thought that maybe Brian would not want to make such a raw, emotional public statement. But he did, and it took a lot of guts. Brian once explained the self-exploratory implication of this song and related it directly to his work on the album. Brian said, quote, "It's about a guy who was crying because he thought he was too advanced and that he'd eventually have to leave people behind." When that interviewer, who, by the way, conducted this interview in 1976, suggested that Brian appeared to share the character's experiences, he responded, quote, "Yes, it did happen to me. I did Pet Sounds, and all my friends thought I was crazy to do it." So as a quick PS here, Lauren Darrow, a.k.a. Lauren Schwartz, wrote in a 2012 blog post that he was the actual subject of the song. He disputed the suggestion that the song was about Brian himself and argued, quote, "Just reading the lyrics will explode that myth. Not made for these times. What goes wrong? It makes no sense." By the way, that, to me, holds no credibility whatsoever.
I agree with you, Dave. That's crazy to me. I think it really does reflect that insecurity that Brian was probably feeling at that moment.
I mean, it seems pretty clear that it's about Brian himself, but it also seems even clearer that it's probably not about Lauren Schwartz.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Although Brian claimed that Tony only provided the words to his music, Tony credited himself with contributing musical ideas to at least 3 songs on the album, including this one. which seems like a stretch to me, but I don't know, I guess maybe. But this is a very sophisticated song. Without knowing any of the circumstances, it doesn't feel like the music of a jingle writer.
Well, you also have to remember, to be a jingle writer, you have to be a damn good musician and wordsmith. And I think what Tony was trying to convey was that this was not an insular process. Songs come about in so many different ways. There are songwriting teams where the preferred working method is the composer provides a lead sheet with the melody and the songwriters separate and the lyricist goes and writes the lyrics on their own without any, real interaction between them, except for fleshing out some confusion. But I think in this case, we know that Tony, for the most part, sat right next to Brian on the piano bench. And I think Tony was enough of a musician to say, hey, why don't we try this chord here? Or why don't you modulate up or down there? So it seems like writing jingles is deceptively simple, where it's probably one of the most difficult things to do.
Honestly, what I'm not doing is disparaging his work in that arena. But, this specific type of song doesn't feel like it could have flowed from out of a guy who did that for a living. And also, I guess part of it is that I don't want that to be true. I definitely want this to be all of Brian's work.
Well, the whole idea here is that it was a collaboration. And I think one of the most interesting and lovely things that I discovered during this whole process of investigating and researching how Pet Sounds was written and recorded is learning that Brian was not such an egotist that he couldn't accept the ideas of other people, because at every turn, as you'll hear in the interviews that I did with most of the major contributors, they felt free enough that they could make a suggestion and Brian would almost universally accept it and say, hey, that's a great idea. So that's why it has always made sense that, Tony could feel free enough to say, hey, musically, why don't we try this? And I think he had the chops to do that.
Agreed, sir. There's a section in your book that I really appreciated because the layers of Brian's vocals are so intensely interwoven that I never was able to extricate exactly what he was saying in all of them. And for this song specifically, he created these elaborate 3-part vocal harmonies for the breaks, especially on the bridge, where the vocal uses different melodies within the same chord structure. I never could hear it. And your book broke it down. And I'm really grateful for it because it's the first time I actually saw them. I certainly could hear Sometimes I Feel Very Sad. Sometimes I Feel Very Sad is clear enough to me. But then Ain't Found the Right Thing I Can Sink My Heart and Soul Into. And then also People I Know Don't Want to Be Where I'm At. All three of those lines being sung at the same time, all three of them kind of competing with each other in a way that kind of negate their actual conscious ingestion by the listener and just form this tapestry of despair.
Well, these are so brilliantly layered. And in this case, you have 3 different lines that are all at once, almost on top of each other, and at the same time, a call and response. It flies by so quickly that it becomes almost background, like it's just a layer of complexity that you feel rather than hear in the sense of focusing on exactly what's being sung. So it's almost like the 3 things together form this total impression that just flies by. When you roll it back and you listen to every single component, you just have to shake your head in wonderment and say, man, this is really sophisticated shit.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it really is. And to me, this is the answer to why Brian Wilson was a genius.
Speaking of, Chuck, take our hand collectively and walk us through why the composition of this song lends itself to being the work of such genius. Oh, hi, I'm Dave Gebroe. I threw my career as a licensed hearing instrument specialist in the trash, sold my house, and moved to the East Coast with my wife and 5-year-old son in order to focus on making the ultimate weekly podcast for music obsessives thrive. But weekly wasn't enough for me, so I bumped it up to 4 shows a week. Becoming a subscriber to Discograffiti's Patreon gives you access to hundreds of exclusive episodes. As a 2-show per week private, you get the weekly show by and for our Patreon family, the Discograffiti Soldiers of Sound podcast. As a 3-show-a-week lieutenant, you'll get early release, ad-free, extended director's cuts of the main show. They're the shows as they were intended to be heard. Plus, you'll gain access to half the Patreon archive and the upcoming Beach Boys Behind the Mirror companion episodes, which will feature dozens of special guests from within the Beach Boys camp talking about and rating their music. But as a 4-show-per-week major, you'll be drowning in a flood of must-hear binge listening, because I'll be bombarding you with episodes about super cool bands that are too subterranean for free Fridays. It's like going to music college, but with a tuition that makes all kinds of sense. Plus, our entire Patreon archive is yours. Discograffiti's Top 10, our Buried Treasure show, Rock Cousteau, our Slag Off show, Queasy Listening, and the Private Press with Paul Major. And all that for the price of only a cup of coffee a week. Times are tough, you say? Fret not, because there's a $1 tier. Or you could just join as a basic member and buy episodes piecemeal from our Patreon shop. Don't risk feeling badly about yourself by not giving. Check out patreon.com/discograffiti to find the tier that's right for you. Once again, that's patreon.com/discograffiti. This episode is brought to you in part by Bespoke LA. Located in the Fairfax district of Los Angeles, Bespoke LA is the modern podcaster's dream come true. It's got 2 podcast pods available, one with audio only and the other with both audio and video. Just think, you can start your own podcast tomorrow without investing a single penny in equipment. What, you don't have experience editing? Don't even sweat it. For an additional fee, Bespoke LA can edit your podcast. Or not, it's entirely up to you. Rates start at $75 an hour with discounts if you book 4 sessions at once. Go to bespokela.com/podcast. That's BSPOKELA.com/podcast for more information or to book your time today. And be sure to tell them that Dave sent you for a one-time 25% discount.
Well, when you think about the composition of this song, there are so many unusual sounds. You know, a honky-tonk style piano part that Don Randy plays, that's on a tack piano. And that happens during the chorus, but it's really mixed low in the recording. It's kind of sublimated in there, but it's substantially more audible in the stereo mix that Mark Lynette created for the Pet Sound sessions. And again, it's a texture, it's a feel. You know, a lot of these passing phrases, these passing musical phrases that Brian dreamed up are played by such unusual instruments, and in many cases, unexpected instruments, that it just adds to this whole mountain of sound and texture and feel. So, you know, to me, that's genius. And it's really reflected in this particular song. I remember Paul Tanner telling me that what Brian wanted was actually beyond the limitations of the Electro-Theremin, that he really was describing a sound that could be made by the theremin, which was a very interesting instrument that you played or you controlled by your hand movements in front of an electric kind of frequency generator. So the fact that he was able to not just think of these things, but actually create them and distill them into a record is just beyond comprehension.
Yeah, it's incredible. As we had alluded to before, Dr. Paul Tanner has had a pretty storied history. As a UCLA music professor, he had actually developed the Electro-Theremin with a guy named Bob Whitesell, who was an electronics wizard back in 1958. And then 8 years later wound up playing it on Pet Sounds. Without giving too much away from the interview that you did with him, he has an interestingly self-effacing attitude toward his own invention, kind of dismissing it as toy time, because he actually had introduced it to, I believe it was Robert Moog, right? And
Right.
Tanner's instrument was not like a theremin. A theremin is something I've had experience with, and it is as out of control as an enraged bronco. And, even for a master musician, it's got its own peculiarities and does what it wants. And Tanner's instrument was played like a keyboard. It just had a slightly different sound.
Well, it came out of a real need. The traditional theremin, I like to call it a most unpredictable instrument because you didn't have the kind of control of any other instrument in the orchestra. So you could write general notes that you wanted it to make, but, having someone interpret those notes exactly and be as precise as with a trombone, let's say, which has a slide and lets you glide from note to note in much the same way as with a theremin, just wasn't possible. And it was really out of practicality that Paul Tanner said, hey, I'm getting all these calls now to do these theremin dates. Let me make something that's more predictable and precise. And that's exactly what he did. He just basically used electronics and made something that you could go to a definite C note, then glide up to a higher note or go down to a lower note.
Right, just like a trombone.
What I think is most interesting about this, though, David, is the fact that Brian Wilson, at 22 and 23 years old, was attuned to the sound of a theremin, which he would have gleaned from watching old film noir movies of the 1940s and early 50s.
Well, I don't know, because in your interview with Tony Asher, I don't get that sense. And there was something that felt pretty honest on Tony's part, that he tipped his hat to the fact that Brian really didn't know what a theremin was. Tony's quote, and I'm paraphrasing possibly, but not by much, Brian said to him, "What the fuck is a theremin?" That puts a little twist on the tale.
But I think once he heard it, he probably said, that's right. It.
He had to have known what it was.
Because here's the thing, the theremin itself was really invented as a novelty instrument. This is before video games and videotape and things that would occupy people's time. It was just another diversion. Hey, play this instrument at home. You don't need any experience. All you have to do is move your hands between two antennas and you can create music. I mean, it was a really big thing back in the 30s. And then, of course, it became a staple of horror movies and mysteries and things like that. And Hitchcock brought that to its apotheosis. And this sound was in the air. So even if Brian, as a kid, overheard his father and mother watching the Late Late Show or the Alfred Hitchcock Presents or something, he probably heard the theremin. So he just needed to connect the name of the instrument to the sound.
I definitely agree with that.
He surely knew the sound. And just knowing Brian's music, he probably said, oh, how cool is that?
Yeah. I want to quote from your interview with him. This is Dr. Paul Tanner. Quote, "The Electro-Theremin didn't have the fine tonal quality of a real theremin, but our instrument was much easier to play and sounded so close that the people hiring me thought that it was a theremin." And in fact, history has been bent in such a way that when people talk about this song, and especially Good Vibrations, it's always referred to as a theremin. It's almost never referred to as an Electro-Theremin. Almost never. 99 times out of 100, people call it a theremin. This is back to the interview. We didn't know what to call it, so we settled on the name Electro-Theremin. And interestingly, the prototype was finished just hours before the premiere recording session on which the instrument made its debut, which was a 1958 album called Music for Heavenly Bodies. And just as another layer of bemusement to this whole story is, Tanner, who again was this looming presence in music history, was pretty surprised when Brian Wilson placed the call himself to him, asking him to come to the session. Here's Tanner again, quote, "Brian phoned and spoke to my wife. I was on a record date, but she knew that the person I was playing for had never heard of overtime. She told him that I would be through with that session at 11 p.m. Brian said, good, then my session will start at 11:30. She called me and I went to the studio when I finished the other session, and Brian started putting little pieces of the melody together. To Tanner, the sessions were interminable. Quote, we'd work all night long and then get called back a couple of days later to put more pieces together. We never had any idea what we were doing.
You know, that's a common theme, David, with many of the musicians, especially the ones that weren't the core players on Brian's records. They had no idea where their part was going to fit in. Often Brian would just have them play some notes without the context of any other music, and they didn't even know what it was going to be used for until they actually heard the record months later.
Yeah, I mean, not only is it a common thread, Chuck, it's in every single one of your interviews with the session musicians.
Yeah.
It's unreal. It's so funny, you know, as someone who's listening to these back to back, I just start counting down to when the mention is going to happen.
That's funny.
Yeah.
It's true. What I think is neat is that Brian was captivated enough by the Electro-Theremin that he used it in a crucial portion of Good Vibrations, and then again on Wild Honey.
I love it on Wild Honey. It's a simple part that he uses it on, but it is terrific. It really makes the song.
Yeah, he knew how to use these instruments to great effect, really.
So Brian produced the backing track, which was actually logged, and I love this. It was logged on the contract as I just wasn't made for these things. On Valentine's Day, 1966, Brian hired Paul Tanner to play the Electro-Theremin, possibly with the mistaken assumption that he was using a real theremin for the song's recording. But, you know, to counter what Tony said, potentially, in a 1996 interview, Brian said that he had been frightened by the, quote, witchy, bewitching sounds of a theremin as a child and couldn't remember, quote, how the heck I ever arrived at the place where I'd want to get one, but we got it. Now, Tony says it was his idea, so maybe that's how he arrived at it. But like you and I have mentioned a couple times through the course of our deep dive, Alfred Hitchcock's Spellbound is really the film that's most notorious for proffering the instrument.
Oh, by the way, I mean, another great Hitchcock film is Notorious.
That's true. But the most common presence of the theremin was in the theme music for My Favorite Martian, which wasn't that Tanner who did it?
Yeah, that was Paul Tanner.
So Chuck Britt said, quote, he just walked in and said, I have this new sound for you. I think he must have heard the sound somewhere and loved it and built a song around it. I wonder if that's true, by the way, Chuck, that he built this song around the theremin versus adding the theremin afterwards as a way to develop the themes of the lyric.
It's entirely possible. You know, I've spoken to dozens of songwriters, and of course, the question that I ask is, where does the inspiration come from? Every answer is different. You know, it could be as simple as Billy Joel saying, hey, I was on my way to the studio today and I heard a James Brown song, and he would sit at the piano and just start to improvise and sing like James Brown in James Brown's voice. And then a song would evolve from that. Others have said, hey, I remember this little passing phrase from a film soundtrack, and I decided to invert it and build on that. So it's entirely possible that Brian built the song around that sound. We just don't know.
Right.
I never was able to confirm either way how that happened.
Well, one thing seems to be for sure is that biographer John Tobler had stated that Brian Wilson thought of using the instrument after having watched a Bette Davis horror film, and that seems to not be true based on what I know about this. One last thing about Paul Tanner's experience in the session, as he recalled, you know, just like everyone else who participated in any of Brian's recordings, Brian did not provide notation and instead just sung Tanner's part for him to play. So Paul remembered, quote, Brian came over to me and sang such and such a thing. And I said, well, write it down and I'll play it. And he said, write it down? We don't write anything down. If you want it written down, you have to write it down yourself.
That is so Brian.
Yeah.
And sometimes if he had to write something out, he would turn to either Hal Blaine or Carol Kay and say, hey, could you write this out? And he would hand them sometimes a little slip of paper, could have been the back of an envelope with something that he himself had written out. Mm-hmm. And the stem would be on the wrong side of the note. You know, it was just an interesting little observation that they had. And they would say, okay, Brian, we'll notate it for you. And they did it.
Brian initially attempted to record at Western, but he ran out of studio time and immediately moved to Gold Star and take 6 of the orchestra's performance was marked as the best, after which the session was concluded with the recording of Wilson's lead vocal. The group vocal overdubs for the song followed on March 10th and April 13th at Columbia with that 8-track machine and involved all 6 of the Beach Boys.
So you're seeing a pattern here. What Brian would do is he would record the instrumental tracks at Western or Gold Star, which he used quite interchangeably, and then go over to Columbia for the vocals, because at that point, he wanted to take advantage of that 8-track capability.
I want to just quote something from the writer Bob Stanley from his book, Yeah, 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 The Story of Modern Pop, which was published in 2013. I just think this is very, very well and aptly put and sums it up perfectly. Though he was the leader of the biggest pop group in America, though he was married to a thoughtful and loving woman, though he was only 23, there was something incredibly old and incredibly melancholy within Brian Wilson. Sometimes I feel very sad, the song goes, and no amount of convoluted Bob Dylan or Joni Mitchell wordplay is as effective or affecting.
That's so beautifully stated. It really is. And melancholy is absolutely the right word to describe this song.
In 2016, the staff of Treble Zine ranked I Just Wasn't Made for These Times number 3 in their list of the finest songs of the counterculture era, calling it both a mild rebuke to the temporal world that Wilson endured and an intense wish to belong to it.
Nice. So on June 4th of 1996, Sub Pop released a stereo mix of I Just Wasn't Made for These Times as a single with the vocal-only version of Wouldn't It Be Nice and with the stereo backing track to hear today as the B-side.
Let's talk a little bit about the legacy of the song, which in some ways is limitless, and I think we've not even begun to see quite the amount of ripples that are going to wind up reverberating out from this song being in existence. But in the 1990s, Brian and the amazing Andy Paley recorded a spiritual successor to the song, which was titled It's Not Easy Being Me. And by the way, the Paley sessions, which we're not going to get to for quite some time, unfortunately, is truly, for me, the last completely on fire experience that Brian Wilson had in the studio, where he was firing on all cylinders in a Pet Sounds type way. The only other experience that I can even point to would be that Lucky Old Son. But for me, there's something of an end at the Paley sessions, and that's when It's Not Easy Being Me was recorded. The song was actually released on the soundtrack to the 2021 documentary Brian Wilson, Long Promised Road, which is basically a feature-length attempt to try to get Brian to be open during an interview, which is never actually achieved.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Brian was asked in a 2011 interview if he had still felt that he wasn't made for these times. He responded, quote, "It was like saying either I'm too far ahead of my time or I'm not up to my time. Now I do feel I was made for these times." And I'm really very, very happy that that was the case. Even if it was an off-the-cuff response he didn't mean, I hope that toward the end of his life, especially with all the children that he and Melinda adopted, I hope he was able to find a sense of presence and a sense of being relaxed and content in the moment, a feeling that I'm still searching for, but I hope he found it.
I think he did, quite honestly. You know, the music that he created after his comeback, and after all of the pain and the difficulties he's experienced, is truly amazing to me. He did the Gershwin album, which was just a fun flight of fancy, but really is a musically solid record. And then my good friend Nancy Sinatra asked Brian if he would do vocals on her recording of California Girls, and he readily accepted because they were good friends. And Nancy described Brian coming to the studio, bringing Jeff Foskett, and how he directed the layer by layer overdubbing of he and Jeff just singing behind her, and how miraculous it was to watch. You know, that is just indicative of Brian being content, just creating music. I think that was his lane of comfort.
Let's talk about how you and I connect to this song, Chuck, if we see this as an emotional concept album. You want to kick off the proceedings?
Sure. Well, I think I've already explained that to me, this is ground zero for what this record and what Brian Wilson at that moment are all about. So, yes, of course, this fits and actually defines and sets in stone the concept of this record, and that is finding yourself. How you find yourself in a relationship, how you deal with the joys and the positive moments in a relationship, and then how you cope with the downside, when the relationship goes south and is sad. So this to me is the real linchpin of the album, and it's the real reason for the album's existence. I think this defines what Brian was trying to say in making Pet Sounds. So to me, it's a record that has resonated for a long time since I was very young. Even though I couldn't understand it when I was 13, when I really discovered the album Pet Sounds, I remember this song and that melancholy chordal structure really having an effect on me emotionally. And it does today. I really believe that this is probably the most powerful and subtly melancholy and subtly effective songs at illustrating emotion.
I honestly couldn't disagree with you more. To me, the melancholia in this song bashes me over the head with a sledgehammer in such an overt way that I can barely take it. Aside from the fact that this is my favorite song of all time, it's my favorite song on the album, obviously, my favorite Beach Boys song. And how I connect with this is me to a T. I mean, for Brian, I think there's the incipient feelings of an innate paranoia that would really come to the surface a few years later, and a persecution complex that I fully sense that are front and center here. The sadness, like I mentioned before, for me is full bore. There's nothing to me that's subtle about it at all. The music is suffused with it. The lyric is dripping with it. And, honestly, the fact that this is such a favorite for me is almost embarrassing, because what it says about me is it makes me an open book. When I was 14 years old in 1986, I was watching Gimme Shelter and Woodstock. In other words, a man out of time. I've always been a dude out of time. When I was making films in the 1990s and the 2000s, I should have been doing it in the 1970s, when the films that I made, I could have very easily had a career spring out of just making those films. Instead, I was a man out of time. I wasn't made for the times in which I was doing that work. And so the timing was just off for that to occur for me. And so it became instead, these incredible experiences that I had with great byproducts that didn't lead to a career. I could point to 1,000 things that would lend itself to the fact that 2025 shouldn't be when I was 53 years old. But in the end, it's pointless, because this is when I was meant to be alive. And clearly here I am, and I am 53, but that sense never left me.
I really like how you put that. That's excellent. To me, I always felt that even though there is this underlying sense of melancholy, there is an optimism there. And I think it's because what Brian achieved here is something that resonates with any male who has gone through adolescence. So I can feel and relive the moment of uncertainty when I was 13, 14, and 15 years old, when I hear this song, even decades later. And I remember that being a message like, it's okay, I'm not the only one going through this. And I think that was Brian's aim, is to create something that told people, especially young adolescent males at the time, hey, you're not the only one that's experiencing this.
Yeah, you're not alone, for sure. Thank you so much, Chuck. I appreciate it, man. I appreciate you.
Thank you, David. And I appreciate you. And I am grateful for you having me join you on these podcasts.
All right, that about does it. To access the rest of this episode and the entirety of our discussion of the record's title track, visit patreon.com/discograffiti and either subscribe to the Lieutenant or Major tier, or just grab the director's cut of this episode as a one-off. Stay tuned, because next week brings upon us our exclusive interview with Pet Sounds lyricist Tony Asher. Okay, here's the week up ahead. This Sunday, our weekly show within a show, the Discograffiti Soldiers of Sound podcast, drops for our Patreon's private tier. These are real people with talent and a burning fire deep inside, just like you and I. Then come Monday, the Major tier gets a very special treat. It's the next entry in the Chuck Granata Pet Sounds interview series, Chuck's chat with Dr. Paul Tanner, inventor along with Bob Whitsell of the Electro-Theremin, which he then famously played on 3 Beach Boys tracks: I Just Wasn't Made for These Times, Good Vibrations, and Wild Honey. Paul passed away a few years later in 2013, which makes this posthumously released Chuck chat yet another priceless buried treasure. There will be a very short sneak peek running publicly for free on Monday morning, but the entirety of the show will only be accessible on the Major tier of our Patreon. Don't miss it, or you'll only be getting part of the story. And then on Wednesday, the Lieutenant tier gets their early release, ad-free, super extended director's cut of our Tony Asher interview. It's the episode as it was truly intended to be heard, with all the essentials left intact. And then come Friday, everyone else gets to join in on the action. A heartfelt Discograffiti thanks goes out to my beautiful wife and son, Jen and Mason, Chuck Granata, Richard Holland, Rudy Fishman, Becky Boyd, Jay Schultz, Bespoke LA, my mom, my dad, Joe Kennedy for that killer new theme song, my incredibly loyal fans, and especially the entire Patreon community, the Soldiers of Sound. I love every last one of you, and this show would not exist without you, my friends. Speaking of friends, it's high time for some new ones. They're in our Facebook group, Discograffiti Soldiers of Sound. That's the best way to find out what's coming up on the show, but there's a hell of a lot more. You get recaps of the day in music history, the ability to pitch questions to guests, polls that put you in the driver's seat on guest and band decisions, access to a thriving creative hub if you're looking for a collaborator, and much, much more. So make sure you don't miss out. You can find the link to the Discograffiti Soldiers of Sound Facebook page right there in the show notes. And if you don't mess with the Zuck, no sweat. Just email me at info@discograffiti.com and I'll keep you in the loop. So now that it's done and you want more, another way to dive even deeper into the classic rock and roll from the 1960s is to go to the Beach Boys Season 1, Catch a Wave, 1961 to 1964, from episode 189 on, the Righteous Brothers Bill Medley interview, that's 181 and 182, my interview with the Free Design, that's 160 to 162, my epic interview with the Mamas and Papas Michelle Phillips, that's 141 to 159, Blood, Sweat, and Tears, that's 137, my 12-hour interview with Terry Kirkman and Jules Alexander from the Association, that's 109 to 113, Vashti Bunyan reading her entire output, that's 103 to 104, Sergio Diaz from Os Mutantes, that's 86 and 87, Bert Summer, that's 83 and 84, Sweetwater is episode 79, a tribute to David Crosby, 77 and 78, Andrew Tuttle rates the Monks, 74, Jim Florentine on Black Sabbath is 64 to 68, Lou Barlow on the Zombies is 59 and 60, Marvin Gaye biographer David Ritz rates Marvin Gaye, that's 45 to 47. Blind Faith is 43. Anthony Fantano rates the Velvet Underground is 32 and 33. Bob Forrest rates the band is 25 and 27. Monkees manager Andrew Sandoval rates the Monkees, that's 22 and 23. Don Randy rates David Axelrod is 17. Badfinger is 16. The Bee Gees is 10 and 11. Sly and the Family Stone is 5, 6, and 7. And Pink Floyd is 1 and 2. And of course, be sure to mark your calendars, because next Friday, October 31st, just a day shy of Discograffiti's 4-year birthday, we're coming at you with our exclusive interview with Pet Sounds lyricist Tony Asher. Trust me, you're not going to want to miss it. And so, from now till then, Don't let our youth go to waste, lads and ladies. It's Discograffiti!